So I'd love to welcome our esteemed guest, Jill Perry, who you will see below. So just a little bit about Jill. Jill is doing her part to make the world a better place. As a therapist with over 25 years of experience, she specializes in dealing with substance abuse and recovery as well as trauma. She is a nationally certified counselor, certified advanced drug and alcohol counselor, and a substance abuse professional. In addition, she is trained in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, a technique used to help people process trauma and get relief from physical and emotional symptoms. Ms. Perry owns and operates JP Counseling and Associates LLC in Beaver, where the staff have experience in substance and recovery, trauma, grief, and marital counseling. In addition, Ms. Perry coordinates the Let Us Know grant for Beaver County Behavioral Health, a data and outreach grant focused on the changing opioid epidemic. Ms. Perry is an enthusiastic trainer and public speaker and teaches and motivates professionals and the community. She's a distinguished Toastmaster, the highest achievement in Toastmasters International, which is a public speaking and leadership organization. When she's not helping others or working, Jill enjoys time with her family, including her teenage and young adult kids, as well as writing. She invites you to continue your work to help save the world. Jill, take it away.
All right, Sarah, thanks so much. I realized as you were reading that, I have to update that. That Let Us Know grant just finished the end of September. So, and now I'm on to a new grant, but that's neither here nor there for what we're going to talk about today. So I appreciate you guys having me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about what's happening with the pandemic, not necessarily the pandemic itself, but how it's affecting us. And there's some not so great things about that, and there's actually some really good things about that. So that's what I want to talk about and give you some tips, hopefully, that you can carry into the rest of your professional life there at school and your personal life to kind of make things move forward. So I did notice, I think Sarah had told me there were a bunch of you here from a class, and I am wondering what class that is. So if someone wants to throw that up in the chat for me, some of you might just be here on your own, but I am curious about what class that is. Now, I have to see if I can figure out my chat. Sarah gave me this really good training.
The bubble. I think it's English composition.
Interesting. Okay. Excellent. Good. Well, let's get started. So you heard a little bit about me. I think the main thing, just to give me a little bit of credibility, is just to know that I'm a therapist and have been for a long, long time. And so I see my role as working with people with the head and the heart. So I always say that therapy is it's an art and a science. So there is a lot of science to it. We know a lot about how the brain works and neurotransmitters and serotonin and all those kind of things. But there also is very much an art to know when people need to be pushed, when they need to be confronted, when they need to be just supported. And that's kind of the art of figuring out how to do. So other than that, we just go on. If you have anything to add or any questions at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and jump in or throw something in the chat. I can see the chat, so I did figure it out. So moving on. When we talk about things like the pandemic, one of the things I always encourage people to do at the very beginning when we start to talk is just to take a moment, and I invite you just to breathe. Because one of the things that happens when we're dealing with trauma, and the pandemic certainly has been a trauma in various ways, is we forget to breathe, right? We just kind of go on automatic pilot. And breathing and breath is one of the most basic things to help us with our mental health. It is nourishing for the brain, it's nourishing for the heart. So I just encourage you to take a minute to just breathe. I know with your classes and your coursework, you're incredibly busy and you have all kinds of other stuff going on. So just take a moment. I also like to take just a minute of reflection, just to kind of frame, and this is kind of preaching to the choir. I think we know these things, but just to remember that what we're dealing with right now over the last year and a half plus during the pandemic is largely unprecedented. There's really no one alive that has been through anything quite like this. I mean, we've had pandemics the past, but not in your lifetime, not in my lifetime. And so everything we're kind of navigating is new and different. And I think it's important that we remember that, and to remember that each of you as students have a lot of responsibilities. You have responsibilities for your families, for your schoolwork, for your community, and most of all, you have responsibility to take care of yourself. So you have to do that in the context of this kind of crazy time of what's going on. We're going to talk today about how the pandemic has affected mental health. And so I always like to start by just really framing what that is. Sometimes the word mental health has a stigma to it, but everybody has mental health, and some of it we have stronger areas and we have weaker areas. I will say one thing about your generation. I'm speaking mostly to traditional college age students there. One of the things about your generation that I have noticed about your age group versus older age groups is you seem much more open to recognizing that mental health is important. And I think that's a beautiful thing. You know, back in the day, we focused on physical health, and if you had mental health issues, you were just crazy. And I think your generation has really learned that mental health is just as important as physical health, and to be kind with yourselves when it comes to mental health, and kind, hopefully, with each other too. So when we're dealing with mental health, it affects everything that we do. So when we have physical health problems, that affects our mental health. When we have financial issues, that affects our mental health. When we have death, when we have a pandemic, all those things has an impact on our mental health. So these are just a couple things I put in to kind of lighten the mood for us. I don't know how many of you really remember Kermit the Frog, but he says, sometimes I feel like I have my life together, and then I'm like, wow, that was a really nice 45 seconds. I've really felt like that a lot lately. Maybe you guys have too. And then this is my favorite little therapy dog. You know, after I share all my problems with him, he's like, I don't know that I'm really cut out for this, maybe. So back to mental health. Mental health, the definition of mental health, it really talks about including our emotional, our psychological, and our social well-being. It impacts how we think, how we feel, and how we act. And it also determines how we handle stress, how we interact with others, and how we make decisions in our lives. So it's pretty important stuff, right? The World Health Organization describes mental health or health in general, as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely just the absence of disease or infirmity. And that's important, because I will tell you, in my line of work back in the day, we focused on pathology. What is wrong with this person? Like every patient that came in the door, like, what is wrong with them? What is wrong with them? And what we've really found is that we can find something wrong with all of us, right? I always say I'm the queen of diagnosis. I could diagnose any one of you if you would like. But that's really not what it's all about. What it's really all about is looking at how that pathology interacts with all the positive strengths and resiliencies that we have. And that's an important thing. So it's not just looking at not having something wrong with us. It's looking at what is wrong with us sometimes and how we handle that. The World Health Organization also says it's a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stressors of life, and I underline and italicize normal, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make contribution to the community. That word normal, I think, is so important, because our mental health looks one way when everything is going fine, right? And our mental health might look very different when things aren't going so smoothly. And the last year and a half has been kind of not one of those times where things hasn't been so smoothly. So our mental health might look a little bit different. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic. And this is one of the graphs I like to use to talk to people about what's happening in the pandemic, as a community, you know, as a country, as Beaver County, as Penn State Beaver, as our own little families, and across the world. If you look over to the left, if you look where we had the dip there into impact was when really COVID was starting to hit. And that was, early last year, February-ish, February, March of 2020. And one of the things I remember about it is, I run a practice here. We have 9 therapists, including myself, and we did all of our sessions in person. We didn't do any telehealth. We just didn't. And actually, if you would have asked me in January of 2020, if you would have said, hey, Jill, I'm going to go see a therapist and do telehealth, I would have said, don't do it. It's hokey, and you can't get good therapy that way. And then the pandemic hit, and we were like, people still need help. Like, we have patients that we can't just close up shop. And, I feel very strongly as an owner that I have people whose livelihoods depend on getting their paychecks. So they need to keep working. And so in an instant, we had to look and say, all right, what can telehealth offer for us? And I will tell you that I then became a believer very quickly. We trained staff, we got some good trainers in, and we started doing telehealth. And the more we started doing it, I became a believer that there can be good therapy work that's done through virtual means. Doesn't always have to be that way, and not everybody responds, but it's good. But that was happening in that impact. Things were happening really quickly, and maybe you remember what it was like for you when that was starting to happen. If you were at school, whether you were still in high school or whether you were in college already, maybe you were being moved to virtual. And that happened pretty quickly, right? You were like, oh, I guess this is how school is now. Pretty quickly after the impact of COVID really started, we started to have this uptick of this heroics. And that was a really beautiful time. I remember just a few days after things got really big here. I live in Beaver, and I was heading up toward like Tuscarawas Road in Brighton Township, if you're familiar with that. And off to the right was this tent. This family had put up this tent with some canned goods and things, and they said, take what you need, leave what you can. And that stayed up for months and months and months, and other places like that opened up across the county and across the country and probably the world. So there were heroics. People were donating PPE and personal protective equipment to hospitals and various places, and checking on elderly people and all those types of things. We little by little moved into kind of a honeymoon period where we said, you know what, we could do this. I remember working from home doing telehealth thinking, this is kind of good, actually. Maybe this is even better. This is fine. It's just fine. And then you see in about the middle of the page that quick drop off into disillusionment where, myself, for example, was saying, how much longer do I have to do this? Like, when can I get back in the office? Like, when is life going to go back to normal? And that's what people started to say and get really frustrated with. Little by little, we moved into this period of reconstruction, which we're kind of in now. But one of the things we've learned about crisis and trauma is when there is an event, this is what we've studied, when there's an event, then it takes, let's say 9/11, for example. Some of you were around for 9/11. Some of you may remember it, or at least hopefully have heard people talk about it. But, 9/11 was a day. It was an event that happened. And what they studied from that is it took about a year after 9/11 of 2001, until people started to be able to kind of recover and start to heal. So it took an entire year before healing could start. Now, what's different in the pandemic is we didn't have an event and then it was over, and then we took a year and then started to heal. We're still in the midst of it and trying to heal. And that makes a big, big difference about how we're handling everything that's going on. So one of the things that's happening in the pandemic in our mental health is that we're all dealing with some grief. And Kubler-Ross, some of you may have studied this, puts this in this beautiful little, very smooth cycle, denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and eventually we move to acceptance. And these have been studied, and this is really core to what happens in any grief. You lose a person that's important to you, you lose a job, you have a medical condition where you lose certain functionality of your daily living, whatever the loss is, your pet, these are the cycles we tend to go through. Kubler-Ross, I think, makes it look nice and smooth, which is good for understanding, but I tend to think it looks a little more like this. It's a little more chaotic. We're in more than one stage at a time sometimes, and it gets a little crazy. And so what's happening with the pandemic is all of us have some level of grief about the life that we had pre-pandemic. You know, I just got back from a really great trip, family trip, for a wedding to Vegas. And, you know, you're wearing masks on the airplane. You're wearing masks everywhere you go inside in Vegas. So pretty much, except for taking a walk outside from one place to another, you're wearing your mask all day long. Like, I really miss those days where you just didn't have to wear a mask. I understand why we are, and I'm good with it. But I miss the days where we didn't have to deal with that. You know, I miss, and I think this affects you guys, I miss the days when my kids didn't have to do virtual school. I miss the days when they just knew that they were going to go to school. They knew that they were going to have a prom. They knew that they were going to have certain events and concerts and all kinds of exciting things that they could go to. My two youngest are graduating from high school this year, and I'm hoping that they get a ceremony. We'll see. You know, time will tell. So that's a lot of grief, and that brings out all these different emotions to us at various times. And I really encourage you to think about that for yourself. If you feel out of place, if you feel like, I just don't quite feel like myself right now, that it may be a little bit of this grief that's going on. And you want to be able to kind of take a look at that. And I would encourage you to remember that for everybody that's around you. So everybody's dealing with that, from the sweet little lady that lives down the street to the big old jerk on the highway who's got all kinds of road rage. Everybody's dealing with this grief, and we're dealing with it. We're all in different stages and different things at different times. So it's important things just to kind of keep as a frame of reference. This is Mona Lisa, different stages of quarantine. You've probably seen this before. I think I tend to hover right around this middle bottom here, but I've bumped around. Or Britney Spears, you know, one of my favorites. Yeah, probably right around that bottom line is where I tend to hover, dealing with the pandemic. You can figure out kind of where you are. So we want to remember that in what we're dealing with right now, nothing is really normal. You know, what we used to count on before isn't necessarily what we can count on now. There's lots of uncertainty, and you guys as students are feeling it in ways that I think is taking us a little bit longer to catch up to. But you're certainly dealing with physical uncertainty, financial uncertainty, emotional uncertainty, and being worried. Are you going to be able to take care of what you need to take care of to get what you need, including work and money and food? Like, I'm hearing all these things now that we might not have turkeys for Thanksgiving. Who knows? But social connections too. And as you know, I think one of the things that is a blessing and probably a curse in some ways for your generation is you guys are really in touch with technology. So you were well ahead of my generation or an older generation when the pandemic hit, because you already knew how to stay in touch and socially connected with technology. So that really puts you ahead. The downside, I think, is you're still missing, when my patients come to the office and they leave, most of my patients, when they leave session, we hug. That's just always what we did. I'm a hugger. What can I say? And they do hard work when they're in therapy session, and we're very connected, and the process is pretty intimate. And so we usually just end with a hug. Not every therapist does that, by the way. But I do. And so I've really missed that kind of element. And I've had patients that I'm doing virtual sessions with say, I really just missed that hug at the end. So we can give a virtual hug or something, but it's just not quite the same. But I want you to remember, too, that everybody's dealing with these difficulties. But individuals who have histories of difficulties with mental health, things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, even things like attention deficit disorder, eating disorders, people who have histories with substance use disorder, who have issues with alcohol or part of the opioid epidemic that we're still dealing with, or we're seeing this rise now in stimulants and amphetamines and even methamphetamine, which we really never saw in the Valley here. So people with a history of substance use disorder and people with a history of trauma are experiencing a lot of what's going on right now even more intensely. And that's just an important thing, I think, to remember and respect about yourself and about the people that are around you. So we want to remember that no one has navigated this global pandemic like this before. And I think I got my slide a little off there, but this isn't something that any of us should just magically know how to do. There's no guru to go to say, hey, how do we deal with this? We have to kind of piece everything together and learn as we go. And I've always been a big advocate that you never know where you're going to learn the lesson. And I've learned that in a lot of ways from working with patients, because they come in here and supposedly I'm the expert as a therapist and they're the ones that are struggling, but sometimes they teach me incredible, incredible things. And so I think that's important to remember, that we don't know where the teacher is or where whoever's going to teach us the lesson. It's good to be open to that. Could be anywhere. So good time from time to time, and now is a good time for you just to sit back and think about what are you noticing that's more challenging to you than it used to be? What are you noticing about some of your thoughts and your feelings and your attitudes about not only about the pandemic, but just about life in general? And then what are you really doing to kind of take care of yourself? And so those are some of the things that we're going to talk more about here. Quick review about the signs of stress. I'm sure you guys could shout them out, but things that we look for are an apathy or a lack of energy, lack of motivation, difficulty making decisions, difficulty keeping track of things, and staying organized, feeling on edge a lot. Physical symptoms, there's a big connection between the mind and the body. So the body tells the story of what's going on in the head. So if we're feeling a lot of stress and frustration and all those types of things, we'll feel it in headaches, in stomach aches, in body aches, all those types of things. Feeling more emotional or being more emotional than before. I had a patient recently, he's probably about my age, so he's, in his 50s, and he is a big biker guy, and he's always very stoic when he comes into therapy. And he shared with me recently that he has been starting to cry, and he doesn't know where it's coming from. Like, he's never experienced this before. And it's just the way the stress is presenting itself in him now. And so he and I had to work on some ways, because he really doesn't want people to see that in him. And then we have seen a huge increase, and this is something I'd really caution you guys out there of traditional college age. We've seen a big increase in the use of alcohol and other drugs, and some of that is not addiction. Some of that is just, what do I do to feel a little bit better? And alcohol and other drugs taps into that pleasure portal in the back of the brain just really quickly. And so if we're looking for something fast, that tends to do it for us. Unfortunately, it can lead to other things. It doesn't for everyone, but with the increase of people using alcohol and other drugs, we've seen an increase of people needing treatment and people dealing with substance use disorder. That leads to additional legal problems and health problems and all sorts of things. So I really caution you about that. You guys are at an age where it's kind of like, many of you have recently turned 21, and so you're supposed to be able to legally drink now, right? And so that's supposed to be a good time. Unfortunately, you're dealing with that in the context of this pandemic, so you just have to be a little more cautious and be a little more sensitive to your friends too, if you notice things and concerns you have for them. So stress is one thing. Everybody deals with stress. Anxiety is kind of the next level up, and we are seeing huge increases in rates of anxiety, particularly in your generation, in the age group between I think they said it was between 15 and 27 is where we're seeing the largest amount of increase in anxiety. So anxiety can show itself in a lot of different ways. We have a kind of an idea in our mind of what anxiety looks like, but it can look like a lot of different things, including excessive worrying, sleeping a lot or not falling asleep. I meant to fix this slide, but sometimes people with anxiety, their mind is going at night, so they can't get to sleep. But sometimes people sleep and sleep and sleep. I have a couple that I work with. They're an older couple, and I kind of, we laugh together because when she gets stressed, she goes out and exercises and does work around the house and she just doesn't stop. When he gets anxious, he just goes to sleep and stays there. So they're dealing with the same stuff, but they just deal with it very differently. With anxiety, sometimes we see issues of agitation and anger issues. So a lot of times when I have people come see me, let's say a wife calls and says, you have to see my husband, he's irritable and angry all the time. One of the first things I start to look for is there some anxiety? That anger and irritability usually is what we call secondary emotions. So there's something else that's presenting it that way. And in our society, this is changing some, but if you think about it, it's more acceptable for men to be angry or irritable than it is to necessarily be emotional or sad. For women, we tend to look at it the other way. When women start to get angry, then we're just bitchy, right? But there's some societal stuff, and some of that is changing, but it's slow moving. So we have to remember that some of those signs of agitation or anger could really be anxiety. Physical symptoms that we see with people, again, the body tells the story of what's going on in the head. Some restlessness, avoiding being putting yourself in social situations, and that we've seen happen more and more lately. Fatigue, some irrational fears. We've seen a lot of that, more of that now than we have in the past, and some of it is rational. Like I think everyone has a little bit of a concern that we could catch COVID and something bad could happen. That's a rational fear based on what's going on in the world. But when we start getting irrational fears about, having to lock ourselves in our houses and not see anyone ever, then that gets a little out of hand. And anxiety can certainly make it difficult for us to concentrate and focus on things that we need to focus on. And then signs of depression. Now you'll notice that a lot of these signs of stress and anxiety and depression kind of overlap. So when I talk about the art of therapy, that's one of the things that we are trained, people like myself, to do, is to figure out is this anxiety or is this depression or is it stress? What is it? Or is it a combination of things? But signs of depression we see are hopelessness. I had a gentleman just say to me earlier this week, I just don't find joy in anything anymore. So that feeling of hopelessness and just things that used to make you happy, just not that exciting anymore. Losing interest in things that you used to really, really enjoy. Increased fatigue and problems with sleeping. Anxiety and depression usually go hand in hand. Irritability, especially in males, and we've talked about that. Changes in appetite and weight. And that's been kind of difficult through the pandemic because most people gained at least a little bit of weight. Not everyone, but most people. And so trying to distinguish between, is that just kind of normal coping, or is that something that's a little more significant, has been challenging sometimes. Sometimes we see people with depression have emotions that are kind of uncontrollable. And then we do see, and unfortunately we have seen, an increase in suicidality, suicidal thoughts, suicidal plans, completed suicides during the pandemic. And so thoughts of people that are starting to look at death a little more as a possible outcome for them, as possible positive outcome for them, is difficult as well. And then post-traumatic stress. So one of the things I often remind people is that pretty much all of us, all of you that are here today, myself included, all have signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. It doesn't necessarily mean we have the disorder. To have the disorder is kind of like the next step. But you can look around at your own behaviors and you can find signs and symptoms of trauma that you've been through. And so a really easy definition about trauma is it's extraordinary things that happen to very ordinary people. So you and I were just normal folk, and so when something happens like a pandemic, which is not something that we ever could have planned for, at least not 100%, that's an extraordinary thing. That's something that kind of comes out of nowhere, and so that's something that we're all dealing with. So we are seeing signs of post-traumatic stress. We're seeing signs of that in a lot of people. We're not necessarily seeing an increase in the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder yet. We might in the future. We are seeing an increase in what we call acute traumatic stress. So the stress that we're dealing with right now, we're seeing people have more difficulties. But time will tell, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on for you guys. And again, you guys probably know this, but you may not have. I guess I would like to just normalize it for you a little bit. So this was a survey that was done in May of this year, and they found it was done at 108 different institutions, higher education, which I think is important, that they didn't just poll students at one place. They went to several different places, and they found that nearly half of the students would rate the value of their education in the past year as fair or poor. So that's something you may be dealing with, not for lack of effort on the staff's part or faculty's part, but again, just everything we've talked about so far today. More than half say they learned less this year compared to pre-COVID years, and about a quarter of the freshmen reported having felt very unprepared for college, and then 35% felt somewhat unprepared. So these are things that you guys are probably dealing with and talking to each other about, and just to kind of normalize it, it's happening across the world. Now, one of the things, I don't remember if I did a slide about this. I did not. But one of the things that I did find in another study that I thought was really interesting is they took students from another crisis, and I don't remember what it was. I wish I did. It was like a tornado. It was like a hurricane or something. Something had happened really bad in an area where they had to rebuild. And so with the students in the classes, some of them, they just had them repeat the grade because they knew that they didn't get everything they needed in that grade. So they took a group of students and said, we're just going to have you repeat whatever grade that is, grade level. And then another group, they said, you know what, we're just going to move you on and see what happens. And what they found is the group that moved ahead and let's see what happens, actually did better in the long run than the students who repeated the grade. And what we assume is happening is, again, we're very resilient people, so we catch up when we need to. And so sometimes it is helpful to repeat a class or a grade or something for reinforcement. But sometimes we're just as good just to move forward through it, and it's just fine. That's true resiliency. So some of the concerns that I said that students like you guys are having, getting a job that fits your degree once you graduate. The job market is really just weird right now. I don't know how else to say it except weird. Getting any type of job once you graduate. So not just thinking about your field, but just being able to get a job at all. 78% of students in this survey said that they were concerned about their own mental health. And again, I think that goes back to this beautiful thing about your generation of being able to recognize how important mental health is. 78% were concerned about friends and family catching the coronavirus, and 73% were concerned about catching it themselves or spreading it to others themselves. So these are real concerns that you guys have, that students like you are having across the board as well. I really like this quote that said, hardships often prepare ordinary people, again, like you and me, for an extraordinary destiny. And I do believe that what we're going through now is building a lot of strengths in all of us, but particularly in your generation, which is going to lead us to lead our world to a better place. So that's some of the signs to look for if you're thinking about anxiety or depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, things that are going on in the pandemic, things like that. But I really wanted to focus a little bit too on the positive things in resiliency. So resiliency, I always like this is how I think of resiliency. It's the human capacity for burden is like bamboo. It's far more flexible than you'd ever believe at first glance. And if you've ever seen that bamboo, I mean, it is flexible. It can go in all sorts of ways, and it still stands and stays strong. And that's resiliency, and that's something that is built in to the human spirit. So when I think of resiliency, I always think of trees. And so if you have a minute, if you're multitasking, take a moment and just look at these next couple of pictures, because what it shows is resiliency, and this is what we're doing. You know, here's a little teeny tree who sprouted up in the middle of a sidewalk. Like, that's not supposed to happen, right? but he made it happen. Here's a tree who, for whatever reason, you know, he grew, and then he grew down, and then he grew back up. You know, so it's a little bit like a roller coaster there, which is kind of what this life is like, I think. Here's a tree that grew out of another tree. So, you know, actually several trees grew out of that one tree. And so we have to remember that when we have loss, like this tree on the ground, that beautiful things can still come from that. That's resiliency. This is the only tree that survived the tsunami in Japan. You can see it over here on the left, and so they built this kind of structure around it to honor it. But what kind of tree survives a tsunami, right? But if that tree can do it, then we can survive most anything. This is a tree of life in Washington, and I just think that's incredible how these things grow out like that. This one grew on the sidewalk and just kept growing out and out and out, and found, if you look at the end of the roots, it just finds its way down to the sidewalk, to the earth, any way it can. And a lot of times that's what we do, is we just find our way through any way we can. This guy grew right out of a rock. This one was chopped down, and he just grew out of the side of himself anyway. I bet whoever chopped him down was not very happy with that. This one grew way out there on a branch in moss. And this guy I just think is funny, because he's growing around that fence, and he's making it. He's going to make it no matter what. So here's a couple principles of resiliency that you have, and that I would encourage you to continue to grow. So number one is cultivate a belief in your ability to cope. So this is not, well, in 12-step recovery, or like Alcoholics Anonymous, we call this fake it till you make it. So just keep pushing through. You know, your beliefs, we know from cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, that our thoughts impact our emotions, and then that impacts our behaviors. So it's more than just think positive and positive things will happen. It's more about our perception of how we look at things. So really think about your belief in your ability to cope. You know, what can you handle? And think about how you transfer that. So one of the things we do with clients when they're dealing with something stressful is we ask them to think about other times when they had stressful situations, and how did they deal with it, and have them really talk through how they got through it in a positive way. And then we look at skills that we can transfer from that situation to their current situation, because the skills are there usually. Number two, stay connected with sources of support. And this is this is incredibly important based on what's going on right now. You know, early on when they started talking about social distancing, I really do not like that term, social distance. I get the 6 feet, you know, but we're not trying to socially distance. We're actually trying to physically distance, right? We're trying to stay 6 feet apart so we can minimize the spread of the coronavirus. What we're not trying to do is socially pull ourselves apart and disconnect ourselves from other people. That's not healthy for us. So, you know, if the world revolved around everything I wanted them to do, we'd call it something different, but it doesn't. But that's staying. We are social beings. Now, some people are extroverts and they need a lot of social connection, and some people are very introverted and they don't need a lot of social interaction, but they still need some. And so we want to find ways that you can continue to always make sure you have those sources of support. Talk about what you're going through. And most of the time, therapy looks like all of these except for the two top middle. Like, I do have a nice big cushy sofa in my office, but I've had few patients lay on it. Sometimes they come in and they're like, can I lay on your sofa? I'm like, hey, whatever floats your boat. But usually we don't do therapy laying down anymore. But it is important to talk about what you're going through, and that does not always have to be with a therapist. A therapist, we're trained so to kind of help you figure it all out, sort it all out. But I became very open to the idea early on in my career that you don't always need someone that's trained. Sometimes someone from a church, sometimes someone from a 12-step meeting, sometimes your best friend, sometimes a random person that you meet on a bus. Who knows, whatever it is. But talk about what you're going through, stay connected with people, and that will help with your resiliency. Being helpful to others. This, I referred a couple times today to Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. If you're not familiar, they have this incredible 12-step philosophy that I think if everyone followed it, we'd have such a beautiful world. But one of the steps later in the 12 steps of any 12-step program is to give back to others. The philosophy is that as I give back to you, I actually heal even more. And that's I think that's true of what's going on now. The more we can reach out and help other people, the more it helps us to heal. So be helpful. And I would say also, and I have to practice this, I tell you, because I'm not always really good at it, but to be kind to other people who may not be so kind. To remember that you don't know what that person's going through. And so the reasons that they're acting the way they are, we don't know what that is right now. And maybe it's not our business to know. But if we can just remember that they're probably going through something, then it might be able to help us be a little kinder. Activate positive emotion. Excuse me, we're going to talk here in just a second about things that activate all those good chemicals in the brain, dopamine, serotonin, all that kind of stuff that makes us literally feel better. And so we want to activate those types of things. Keep things positive as we can. Principle number 6, cultivate an attitude of survivorship. And I pulled this article up. This is from 5 years ago. It's actually been 5 years now. So that's me on the left. And that's my best friend, Kim. And 5 years ago, well, it was over 5 years ago now that I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And when I was going through treatments here in Beaver County, where I did my radiation up at the UPMC Hillman Center at the medical center, they didn't have one of these bells. This is a kind of a tradition when you have cancer places that when you finish your treatment, you get to ring this bell, and they didn't have a bell. And so I was like, dang it, when I finish my treatment, I'm making a bell. And then I finished my treatment, and it really got away from me. I just kind of forgot about it. Life kind of got in the way. And then my dear friend Kim was diagnosed with a different type of cancer, and she had to go through treatments at the radiation center as well. And so that got me kind of motivated. We got the bell up, and she then got to be the very first person to ring that bell. But that's a real sense, when you look at things that you have gone through like that, it can make you realize that you can get through these things too. And then being able to help someone else and share that with someone else, beautiful, beautiful things. And then seek meaning. So one of the studies they've done recently at Harvard about the pandemic found that people who are able to find positive meaning in what's going on right now with the pandemic seem to have lower levels of anxiety and depression, and just seem to be able to function overall better. Now, what is the meaning? It doesn't have to be something big, but being able to find small meanings and purpose is important. So I put some of these versions of the Serenity Prayer to help us find meaning. Lord, grant me the serenity to accept stupid people the way they are, courage to maintain my self-control, and the wisdom to know that I can act on it. If I act on it, I will go to jail. And then this little guy says, God, grant me a vacation to make bearable what I can't change, a friend to make it funny, the wisdom to never get my knickers in a knot because it solves nothing and it just makes me walk funny. This is one of my favorite. Lord, grant me amnesia to forget the folks who bring me down, luck to bump into those who lift me up, and good vision to tell the difference. And then the original serenity prayer, which is grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and really the wisdom to know the difference. And when it comes to mental health, this really is key. A lot of people come into therapy, and when they're dealing with things like depression and anxiety, it's about them trying to control things that they have no control over. And that creates all this difficulty in their emotions. And sometimes they have control over something, but they don't realize that they do. And so they don't do anything about it. And that creates a bunch of different emotions. So really being able to know what we can control and what we can't, and then having the courage to do what we can is really important. And that goes a long way into some spirituality. And when I talk about spirituality, I know in those little serenity prayers, they mention God. That's just the way they showed up on those memes. But in 12-step recovery, they talk about a higher power, who many people choose to call God, but not everyone. And in 12-step recovery, this concept of higher power is, my higher power is something that is more powerful than me alone. So myself with one of you is more powerful than I am by myself. and so it's just a different way to look at it. It doesn't have to be a traditional way that we look at God. For some people it is, and that's beautiful. But it can also be some other way that we define it, which is important. But this concept of spirituality is a big issue that helps us with our resiliency. So having a relationship with yourself, having some purpose about what you're doing, having a relationship with something bigger than you, like a higher power, having a relationship with people around you, with the environment and your culture. So having family, whether that's a biological family or whether that's your group of friends, whatever that is, having that connection is an important part of spirituality, and surrendering to what is. So anything that is here in the present moment, that again, we can't always control those things. So just kind of saying, I have a patient who, well, sometimes I'll say to him, it is what it is. And he says, I hate that saying, which I get, but sometimes it's the truth. If you look at how you see the world, this can help you recognize if you're having, if you're kind of physically drained or if you're physically fit. If you're having some spiritual emptiness, then you may have a lot of pessimism. You may have some immoral decisions and behaviors. Excuse me. You may be envious of others, hold grudges, have little respect for others, have difficulty identifying your own core values and beliefs, lead from your mind without ever thinking from the heart, and feel that your life is without purpose. If you're feeling in a more solid spiritual place, you'll have some more optimism, engage in better decisions, be compassionate and forgiving of yourself and of others. I think it's easier to forgive others a lot than it is to forgive ourselves, but that's an important thing too. Have good respect and be committed to your own values, lead from your mind, your heart, and your soul, and have some motivation and be engaged in life. So some of what we're talking about is change, and this guy up top says, this old white guy says, who wants change? And then everybody's like, yeah, me, I want change. But then he says, well, who wants to change? Everybody puts their hands down because we want to see the world differently, but we don't always want to do our part. So some other things that can contribute to resiliency as we wind down here is really trying to keep your routines. So what are the core things that you have done in the past that keep you kind of grounded, that keep you rooted like those trees? Keep those routines as best you can. But then also some of those routines have to change, right? Before pre-pandemic, I got up every morning and got myself ready and I came to the office. That's what I did. Sometimes now I work from home. And then come to the office later, or some days I don't come into the office at all. And so trying to establish new routines is important too. But routine is the key. And, you know, one thing my kids make fun of me because I do make my bed every day. And I make my bed not because I like making my bed. I actually loathe making my bed. But I make my bed because when I come home at night and get ready to go to bed, I love getting into a bed that's already made. But also it's that routine that this is what I do. It's part of my morning, and it's part of something that whether I'm working from home or working in the office, it just gets done. It's a good thing. Music. I wanted to talk a little bit about music because it's such a powerful, powerful thing. Music can heal the wounds that medicine cannot touch. And if you think about how, you know, I think I've only met 2 people in my entire life, and I've met a lot of people that didn't like music. And I think there might be something wrong with those people. Probably not, but music is such a powerful thing. And if you think about how music impacts your life, you probably can find some really positive ways that it does. This was a really incredible study they did neurologically on songbirds. So they found that canaries stop singing every autumn when the brain cells responsible for song generation in them actually dies. Then the neurons grow back over the winter months, and the birds learn their songs over again in the spring. And the studies say this sign is a sign that music may increase neurogenesis in the brain. So music may be responsible for helping us learn better, helping us live better, helping us feel better, and all sorts of things. I just think that's amazing that these birds lose the neurons and then they come back again. It's just amazing stuff. So if you're looking for music to kind of help you with a certain mood, soothing music like jazz helps us de-stress and can have some healing to it. Even if you don't like jazz, that the rhythm and the way that music is made can be very soothing. Upbeat music always increases endorphins and makes us happy and actually increases our immune system. Pop music boosts energy and helps us exercise better. Rhythmic drumming helps in meditation and can help us be calmer. And classical music helps with memory recall and also deters crime. So if you need to study for a test or you're feeling like robbing a bank, listen to some classical music and it might help you do the right thing. So food is another thing. Food acts into the reward center of the brain. It affects our dopamine levels. So depending on what foods we eat and in what, there's a huge science to it. How much we eat, what time of day we eat, all sorts of things can help us feel better. Some of the foods that are best for the brain, fatty fish like salmon, coffee. I know sometimes I have people who are like, really, coffee? It's not the caffeine in the coffee either. It's the other nutrients and things that are in there. Blueberries, turmeric, broccoli, pumpkin seeds, perfect time of year, right? Dark chocolate, and nuts. So if you're having some issues with mood, these are some of the things you could try to get into your diet on a more regular basis, and you may see some improvement. Here's me that says, don't cook too much, I've already eaten. And grandma says, okay, love, just a snack. Look at that. That's a lot of eggs and a lot of meat. And so one final thing is learning new skills. So learning new skills, whatever it is, does a lot to help the neuroplasticity of the brain. Neuroplasticity in the brain is something we used to think happened just to children, and we thought once the brain was done developing, which is around age 25, that neuroplasticity was already developed and nothing could change anymore. But studies have shown that neuroplasticity can last across the lifetime. And so learning something new, getting yourself outside of the box that you're normally in, can be really helpful. So learning a new language, some sort of new physical activity, puzzles, cooking a new meal, photography, writing a novel, maybe that's something some of you are going to do in your writing class. Those are all, any new skill like that can be helpful. So I'm no cook, but I can follow directions, which says, let the bird chill in the sink for a few hours. He looks pretty chill, I think. Okay, we're going to talk about laughter. Laughter is a really important thing, and it stimulates organs. It activates and releases stress, can soothe our tensions. It improves our immune system. So people who laugh more have better immune systems. It's like natural vitamin C. Can relieve pain, can increase personal satisfaction and our mood. Okay. And then these are a couple, I'm just running through because we're running out of time. Okay, staying connected was important. Okay, technology, yeah. I'm just running through because I want to make sure we get out in time. Here are a couple of resources that you could use if you're looking for help with mental health. There's a crisis line in Pennsylvania, and we found that when people are in crisis, young people like yourselves particularly, sometimes they would rather text than to make a call, and so there is a text line, crisis line in Pennsylvania. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Preventing Suicide in PA. And I want to say this about suicidality is that if you have any concern about someone that you love or care about or know, then talk to someone, because the rates of suicide are going up, and suicidal thoughts are very fluid. They do go away, but we have to catch someone and support them when they're having them in order to get to that point. So if you ever have even the slightest concern, don't ever feel like maybe I shouldn't say something because maybe it's not a big deal, because it's better to be overly cautious. There's a disaster distress helpline, some help you can get for substance use disorders, and then help for veterans as well. And then sometimes when things are falling apart, they may actually be falling into place. So that's kind of the final little positive message I'll leave you with, other than Olivia Benson, who's one of my favorite from Law & Order. She says, you're a fighter. Look at everything you've overcome. Don't give up now. We're getting towards the good stuff. I really think so. So if you guys have any questions, hopefully you got a little bit of something out today. I'm hoping that you leave and take one thing with you. Maybe you laugh a little harder later today. Maybe you put some fatty fish in your diet. I'm not sure what, but I'm hoping that you take a look and at least got a little something out of today. Does anybody have any questions or anything I can answer for you? Excellent. Let me just say too that on the video is going to be available. If you feel like you need to reach out or would like to reach out to me because you have a specific question or something that you'd like to talk about, then you can get my information there on campus, or you can look me up on jpcounselingcenter.org is our website. But you guys are next. You guys are going to save the world. Like, I'm trying, but you guys are really going to do it. Anything else for us today, Sarah?
No. Any questions for Jill? I did drop in the link for your information in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any questions for Jill? Carmen.
Hi, Jill. I just had a question about food. I know you did mention food that could help with our moods, but are there any foods or drinks that we should be staying away from?
Well, that's a good question. So, and I hate this answer, but it's the answer. Fried foods, foods with sugar, foods with the bad fats, so fats that are not natural, anything processed, excessive caffeine, artificial sweeteners. All of those things tend to take away from some of the good things that we get from food. So limiting those is good. And they've actually done some studies where they found that people who are eating a lot of sugar have higher levels of depression. So they have like it hits the reward center quickly and it gives them a little boost, but then the drop is awful. So those are some foods to stay away from. Alcohol, there's not a lot of really good value nutritionally in most alcoholic beverages. However, there are some wines that have, in moderate levels, can give some protection to the heart and actually can build some of the processes in the brain. So, but moderation is the key. So we're talking for a glass of wine, 1 glass of wine a day for a female, 2 glasses of wine a day for a male. or the equivalent to that. But things like beer, things like that usually don't have a lot of nutritional value to them anyway. But they can help us calm down. They can help us have fun. Just be careful, right? Thanks for that question, Carmen.
Any other
Thank
questions?
you.
Good question, Carmen.
Yeah.
All right, well, it's 2 o'clock. I want to thank Jill so much.
Mhm.
This was awesome. I can stop thinking about resiliency now.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can reach her online, jpcounselingcenter.org.
All right. And listen, as a fellow writer, I have always wanted to write a novel, and I have 3 of them I've started. I've never been able to finish. So you guys finish them and then send me a copy. I'll buy it. I'll buy it when you get published.